Senator Bernardi.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on this bill principally because it's something of great concern to me as a parent, and I know it will be to many other parents here. I have children who are in this age bracket, if you will, that are captured by interactions on social media and privy firsthand to some of the positive and negative reactions to it. However, I also want to express my concerns about government overreaching in some certain areas, because I do agree with Senator Layenholm that ultimately children need to be taught a bit of resilience in some ways, and there is not always going to be someone there to pick up the hurt feelings or the pieces in a way. And that is in no way excusing bullying or intimidation or some of the terrible things that some children have to go through. And if you want to consider the impact that it has on children, you just have to consider firsthand the impact it has on some adults. We have had adults, as a result of whether it be mental fragility or whether it be a result of cyberbullying, take their lives because of poor feedback or abuse from Twitter and Facebook and those sorts of things. So there is a certain amount of resilience, and this can take a terrible toll on people, this social media intimidation and bullying. But there are concerns. There are concerns I have about the message that we're sending in many instances. I can imagine, having dealt with many stories and heard many stories from parents who are concerned about how their children are treated in certain circumstances, I can imagine the overwhelming influx of complaints that some of these social media networks will have because someone's son or daughter has had their feelings hurt because they don't like what was said. I've heard of complaints where people, their parents have got engaged in schools or with other parents because their child has been simply defriended. And when you investigate why that child was defriended, it's because the child itself, the child in their own instance, was doing the wrong thing. The peer group said, well, we don't want that. They defriended them on Facebook or whatever it was, and apparently that amounted to some sort of bullying. So I can imagine, there are any number of permutations of what constitutes bullying and what constitutes harassments or insults or things that will upset people's feelings. And so I feel for some of these social media outlets actually who are going to have to deal with this influx, and I suspect that ultimately not all of them will be managed satisfactorily, and I think that the government-appointed ombudsman, if you will be inundated with all sorts of cases in which they're going to have to, or the commissioner, I should say, in which they're going to have to adjudicate. And on the sets of the commissioner is going to be given two sets of powers. And the first is requiring large social media services to remove material from their site. And I do think this is actually a very important step because a number of the large social media outlets are not very good at removing material from their site which is truly offensive. It may be even condoning violence, or it may be distinctly racist. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of consistency, quite frankly, in how they approach things. As a conservative, I would look at some stuff and say, well, why are they allowing that? And yet they'll tear down this. There seems to be, a bit of political correctness in operation at some of them. So, we're adults and we should be able to deal with this stuff, but I do understand how this sort of intimidation or things that denigrate children or make them feel terribly uncomfortable should be removed, and I think this is a positive step. The other aspect of it, and Senator Layenholm touched on it, which is about allowing the Commissioner to issue a notice to an individual who posted material, requiring him to remove it. I think that's reasonable and appropriate if the social media site won't do it. Refrain from posting it again. I think, once again, I think that's reasonable. But I do share Senator Layenholm's thoughts about the apology. You're going to have to issue an apology for posting something that's negative about someone else, even though you might not have breached any particular law. And I'm with Senator Layenholm in the sense that apologies are only worthwhile when they're voluntary. It's like any sort of moral code or any adherence to any faith. When you're coerced into doing it, it lacks this genuineness, and it's worth much, much less than something that is truly heartfelt. It also, and let me just go back to the first bit about the media services, the social media services, where they are approached by the Commissioner. If they fail to respond to the notice the Commissioner has put forward, then he can insist that there is a legal duty to remove the material, and they will face significant fines where it needs to be done. Now, I think this is actually quite reasonable as well, and I'll tell you why. In the adult world, if you are maligned by, for example, a media organisation, and that media organisation allows comments to appear on their blog which further malign you or defame you, or they have a Facebook page in which people post defamatory or other comments that are inappropriate, the media organisation is legally liable for those comments under the Publications Act, I think. And in those circumstances, there are legal avenues in which you can redress any sort of calumny that you feel has been foisted upon you. However, in the world of children who are perhaps less circumspect about the materials that they will post online, and particularly, I have to say, much less so than my generation, because they've grown up with it in the modern age, they don't really have those avenues of legal redress. And I'm not sure that it's appropriate for a child to be suing another child because they've been offended. But it is important that there is a step that where things are inappropriate, a commissioner can step in, or a responsible entity can step in and say, okay, let's try and have this removed without having to go through any convoluted legal practice. So I do think that is reasonable, and it is incumbent upon some of these social media organisations, which I must say are companies in the tens and tens of billions of dollars. They cannot do the Pontius Pilate and wash their hands of responsibility in respect to basic decency in many of these issues, and particularly where it affects children. So the Commissioner can insist the service has a legal duty to remove the material, and it can impose fines where it fails to do so. The fine would be $17,000 for each day the service doesn't act in response to the Commissioner. And in addition to the complaints system, the Commissioner can also be tasked with implementing policies to improve safety for children online. He or she will be responsible for $7.5 million in funding for online safety programs in schools, and overseeing research and information campaigns regarding online safety. Now, all these things are, I'm sure, very helpful initiatives. I think many schools already run online safety initiatives. I know in my experience where boundaries on social media have been crossed, I think many students are made aware of it by the schools. I think they have certainly a direct engagement, because ultimately these things can impact the health and well-being, particularly the mental well-being of our next generation. And of course it is a growing issue, this cyberbullying, and I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to eradicate it, because there have always been bullies, whether it be the colour of your hair, or how tall you were, or whether you had too many donuts at recess time, which I may have been guilty of, Mr. Acting Deputy President.
I suspect so.
Eating the donuts, I must say, and the effects thereof. Yes, I picked up sport late in life, thank you, Senator Collins. But there's always something. Kids are always going to home in on some other issue about another kid, and friendships go in and out of favour, and we all do things as children that we regret later in life, and it's just part of growing up in the learning circle. And as I started my comments today, I think there's an element of this which teaches children resilience, and you know, parents have to have that conversation with them. You have to say, well, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. You know, those sorts of old-fashioned values, that not everything is a cause for, you know, some sort of intervention. You've just got to learn how to deal with some things. And I want to restate, I'm not making excuses for some of the harmful practices that go on. There are terrible things that go on, and kids suffer immeasurably from it. They suffer from peer group pressure, they suffer from all sorts of that happen in it, and there needs to be means in which we can do it. But it is not solely the responsibility of government to step into the space. The government, we need to ensure that government provides opportunities where redress is not normally available. I think that's appropriate. Where, you know, schools perhaps are failing, and I think the education programs and those sorts of things should go on there. But we cannot protect children from all harm, no matter how much we'd like to. We can't, because if we actually seek to do that, if we stop them from climbing trees and taking risks and learning about that there are bad people in society as well, and bad things that can happen to good people, you're actually building a much more fragile, I think, adult society as a result. But this is a step. It's a step, I think, in the right direction. I just don't want to see it overreach. But I do agree with some of my colleagues that say, you know, this is one of the most confronting things for society today. It's not often I quote the President, Barack Obama, the American president, but I do think he said that one of the great challenges facing children today was going to be their contribution to social media. That will have perhaps more of an impact on their future life than almost anything else, because what you do in the intemperance of youth is there forever online, and that's one of the great challenges for I think the next generation, and particularly when they go to employment and they start to look around and say, well, gosh, should I have really done that? But at 16, I guess it's like a tattoo. At 18, it seems like a good idea, and you know, at 45, it doesn't seem quite so clever. With all apologies to those who like their tattoos, but the point of it is that all our children now are vulnerable to this sort of approach. We've got to ensure that there is a degree of prudence, making an allowance for their youthfulness and the indiscretions that take place along with those lines. But we also need to make sure that society as a whole, I think, understands the true long-term implications of where we're at with this. Because I'd hate to see young children or young adults, or teenagers I should say, penalised in some sort of long-term sense because of mistakes they make when they're 15 or 16. We do allow all sorts of circumstances to go under the radar. If someone commits a legal offence, for example, as a juvenile, it's not necessarily carried over into their adult record. I don't think it is. We allow certain criminal convictions to be expunged after a certain period of time. So we do believe in redemption. Unfortunately, in the instances, many of the stuff that goes online, there's no opportunity for that. So I'm loath to judge the youth of today too much for the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And so allowing a reasonable approach, allowing parents and schools and individuals to approach someone that's notionally independent about this to seek redress without having to resort to lengthy legal argument or anything else, I think is a positive step in the right direction. But I will never endorse the replacement of responsibility, both individual responsibility and where there is a diminished responsibility by way of youth or age, the responsibility of parents and schools and other adults that are central to the lives of that child to instruct the child, to teach them, to negotiate with them, to talk with them about some of the issues and some of the consequences, potential consequences, whether they be a recipient of this sort of bullying or whether they be the perpetrator of it. because I've, in my experience, in my talking with other parents of the peer group of my own children, it's a very, very fine line, and quite often it is simply the wrong choice of used words or the wrong emoticon or whatever they choose to put in there that can be picked up. But I do commend the government for tackling it. I think it is important that the government have a look at this. I mean, we are having to deal and tackle the issues that are going to be facing our community for a long, long time to come. And one of the most important issues that we have is that we have resilient, well-rounded, well-adjusted children that are free to pursue their lives in a healthy environment. We want to protect them from harm as much as we can, and that includes not only physical harm, but it includes the emotional harm that can be just as devastating and to their self-esteem as anything else. And we know that it can be a single comment or two comments or something like that drives people in directions that are really very negative, whether it be into eating disorders or to self-harm or into hurting others or even down even worse pathways. And that's the sort of thing governments need to invest in. So an ounce of prevention is always better than a pound of cure. Let's work towards that prevention, but let's work towards it collaboratively with parents, with schools, with counsellors that are in many schools today, and amongst their peer group. And one of the greatest things that I think I was taught, and I've sought to teach my children, it's still a work in progress, is, you know, how would you like that if that was done to you? And it makes you stop and think before you act, and I think that's a really sage advice for any young person. Hopefully, anyone that has a brush with this sort of process will only ever have to learn that lesson once. You'd hope that if someone does the wrong thing online, that they will be, and they go through this process, they will learn their lesson, and as a result will have better citizens in the future and a more considerate and society that says, you know, follows that golden rule, that ethic of reciprocity: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you.
Thank you.